Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Our mission today is to explore a really powerful principle for influencing others.
Right. Drawn from that stack of sources you sent over, focusing on human relations, communication, that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
exactly. And we're going to unpack an idea that sounds, well, almost too simple, you know?
But the sources show it's incredibly effective.
It is. Talking about your own mistakes before pointing out someone else's.
It really flips the script on how most people handle correction, doesn't it?
Totally.
The source material basically frames this idea, admitting your own imperfections, as a way to completely change the dynamic.
Making it easier for the other person to actually hear criticism, right? Or suggestions.
Yeah, without immediately getting defensive.
And we've got some amazing examples from your sources. They cover, like, everything.
From managing staff day to day,
To dealing with family issues.
and even navigating some really high-stakes, tense political relationships.
Yeah, those are intense. We want to look at these different contexts to really see this principle in action, see how it holds up.
The goal here isn't just to see that it works, but maybe dig into why. Why does this approach disarm people so well?
And then, crucially, how you might be able to apply it.
In your own life, yeah, to foster cooperation instead of, that instant pushback or resentment you often get.
Okay, let's dive in. So the core principle, the sources often call it Principle 3, talk about your own mistakes before criticizing the other person.
Simple phrasing.
But the idea behind it is if you humble yourself first, admit you've messed up too.
It makes it dramatically less painful for someone else to take feedback about their stuff, their performance, their behavior, whatever it is.
So what's actually happening there psychologically?
Well, you're essentially stepping down from any kind of perceived high ground. You're not judging.
You're basically saying, look, I get it. I'm not perfect either. Been there.
Exactly. That shared vulnerability, it sort of bypasses their immediate ego defenses.
Okay, let's see how this looks in the real world. Starting with a classic example from the source material. Dale Carnegie, right?
Yeah, and his 19-year-old niece, Josephine.
She was new to the business world, working as his secretary.
And, as the sources put it, a bit susceptible to improvement. Needs some guidance.
Right. So Carnegie needed to correct her on some things, but instead of just, pointing fingers.
He did something pretty interesting. He stopped, paused.
And thought about his own experience.
Yeah. He actually reflected on the, quote, asinine mistakes and blunders he made when he was 19.
Wow.
And when he compared himself back then to Josephine now, he realized her batting average was actually better than his had been.
That's quite an admission.
Yeah.
So how did he start the conversation? Not, Josephine, this is wrong.
No. He started by acknowledging her mistake, yes, but immediately followed with something like, you have made a mistake, Josephine, but the Lord knows it's no worse than many I have made.
Okay, that immediately softens it.
Hugely. And then he emphasized that, real judgment only comes with experience.
Implying she doesn't have it yet, which is normal at 19.
And he even praised her, said she was doing better than he did at her age.
He really leaned into his own history of messing up, didn't he? Talking about the stupid, silly things he'd done.
Yeah, and stating clearly because of his track record, he had, quote, very little inclination to criticize you or anyone.
Powerful framing.
And only then, after laying all that groundwork, shared fallibility, praise.
Only then did he gently bring up the suggestion.
Exactly, and not as an order, but as a question. But don't you think it would have been wiser if you had done so-and-so?
That shift from direct criticism to a soft suggestion, framed by his own admitted flaws. It seems small, but the sources say it was huge.
It made her receptive because she wasn't being attacked by some perfect boss. She could actually hear it.
The psychological payoff, then, is lowering their shield because you're not acting like you've never made a mistake.
Precisely. You're not the flawless auditor. You're just another person who's also stumbled. It lets the other person save face.
They can think, okay, if even he struggled with this stuff, maybe it's not just me being totally useless.
Right. It normalizes the mistake, in a way.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's look at another one from the sources. This was more of an office setting issue. An engineer, E.G. Dillistone.
Dillistone, yeah. And his new typist, who was making, well, a lot of spelling errors, like multiple per page.
Oof. Understandably frustrating for him.
Sure. But he realized pretty quickly that just circling the errors, pointing them out, It wasn't working, wasn't leading to improvement.
Probably just making the typist feel bad or, defensive again.
Likely. So he tried a different approach. Instead of focusing on her mistakes.
He made it about himself.
Yeah, about his own struggles with spelling.
Yeah.
He sat down with her, apparently, and said something like, somehow this word doesn't look quite right to me. It's actually one of the words I always have trouble with.
Oh, interesting. So he identified with the problem itself?
And then he went a step further. He actually showed her how he dealt with his own weakness.
What, like a strategy?
Yeah, he pulled out his, the source calls it his little black thumb index book.
Okay.
Where he kept a personal list of words he found tricky to spell. He even opened it up to the page for her.
Wow, that's vulnerable. And practical.
And crucially, he explained why he did it, connecting it to himself.
I'm very conscious of my spelling now because, people do judge us by our letters and misspellings.
Yeah.
Well, they make us look less professional.
So he framed the struggle and the solution around himself and the bigger picture impact, not her specifically.
Exactly. Not you look unprofessional, but misspellings make us look unprofessional.
Yeah.
Subtle but important shift.
And what was the result? Did she start her own little black book?
The sources say Dillistone wasn't actually sure if she copied his exact system, but the key thing...
Her spelling got better.
Significantly better. The frequency of errors dropped right down after that chat.
So sharing his own struggle with the very same issue and even showing his coping mechanism, it inspired her apparently without ever making her feel stupid or attacked.
That example's great because he didn't just say, I struggle too. He showed the how. It shifts it from, you're bad at this, to,
hey, this is a tough thing for lots of people, myself included, and here's one way I try to manage it.
it's leading by example of imperfection, almost, and self-improvement.
Yeah, it's like an invitation to improve, not a judgment. Much more effective.
Okay, right now, buckle up.
Yeah.
Because the next example takes this whole principle into a completely different league.
Ah, yeah. High-stakes diplomacy.
This story, from your sources, Prince von Bülow, the German imperial chancellor, and the notoriously volatile Kaiser Wilhelm II back in 1909.
Right. The Kaiser was visiting England and just started making these absolutely wild, self-aggrandizing public statements off the cuff.
Wild is putting it mildly, claiming he was the only German friendly to the English,
That he was building a navy against Japan.
that he saved England from Russia and France.
And even that he personally planned the British victory against the Boers in South Africa. Stuff that just wasn't true and incredibly damaging.
The diplomatic dynamite, as you said, caused absolute fury across Europe.
Understandably. And so, in the middle of this firestorm, the Kaiser panics.
And does what some leaders do, tries to shift the blame.
Exactly. He asks his top guy, von Bülow, to just publicly take the fall. Say he gave the Kaiser bad advice.
Wow. Okay. How did von Bülow react initially? The sources say that was a misstep.
It was. He protested. Said something like, it was utterly impossible that anyone could believe he would advise the Kaiser to say such things.
So basically implying that Kaiser was foolish for saying them.
That's exactly how the Kaiser took it. He interpreted it as von Bülow calling him a donkey, basically.
And the reaction?
He blew up, just completely lost it. Von Bülow had, in effect, criticized the Kaiser directly by refusing responsibility for the Kaiser's own words. Big mistake.
Okay, so von Bülow's in hot water. How did he recover from that diplomatic train wreck?
Well, realizing his massive error in the source's stress, he should have started with praise and humility before any hint of criticism. He did the next best thing.
Which was?
He pivoted hard. He immediately started showering the Kaiser with praise. But very specific praise.
Not just empty flattery.
No, highlighting areas where the Kaiser genuinely was knowledgeable, or at least thought he was. Naval matters, military strategy,
Okay.
but especially natural science. Things like the barometer, wireless telegraphy, Röntgen rays. Von Bülow made a point of humbly admitting his own total ignorance in those technical fields.
So he's saying you're brilliant here, here, and here. Places where I know absolutely nothing.
Precisely. He's explicitly stating his own lacks while highlighting the Kaiser's strength.
And then how did he position his own role?
Then he positioned his expertise, history, politics, diplomacy, not as superior, but as sort of complementary, useful alongside the Kaiser's genius in other areas.
Like we complete each other.
Essentially, yes. The underlying message was sort of, Your Majesty is brilliant in these complex areas where I'm lost, and perhaps my specific knowledge in these other areas can help avoid, well, misunderstandings. Because even I, in my field, make errors. He's still subtly admitting fallibility.
And how did the Kaiser, this famously arrogant guy, react to this sudden pivot to praise and humility?
The turnaround was apparently immediate and dramatic. The Kaiser just beamed.
Right.
Felt completely flattered, exalted, forgave everything on the spot, shook von Bülow's hand multiple times,
Wow.
declared enthusiastically that they complete one another famously, and even threatened anyone who dared speak against von Bülow from then on, saying, "I shall punch him in the nose."
Incredible. So even with someone that difficult, that powerful, starting with humility, acknowledging their strengths and your own flaws, it could completely diffuse a potentially explosive situation.
That's what the sources use this example to illustrate really powerfully. Von Bülow saved the day, yes, but the analysis is clear. It would have been so much smoother, so much less dangerous
If he'd started differently.
if he'd started the conversation by talking about his own shortcomings and the Kaiser's superiority before even getting close to implying the Kaiser's statements were a blunder.
The order matters. Disarm the ego first.
Before you deliver anything difficult. Absolutely key.
That's a fantastic, if slightly terrifying illustration.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring it back down to earth. A more personal, relatable context. Parenting.
Right. Your sources share an example from a Clarence Sirhusen.
Yeah, he found out his 15-year-old son was experimenting with cigarettes.
And this one's particularly interesting because Sirhusen and his wife were smokers themselves.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So they instantly recognized they were setting a, quote, bad example.
Right. Creates a tricky dynamic for correction.
So instead of the usual parental playbook, threats, warnings, lectures
Sirhusen applied this principle we're discussing. He shared his own story.
about starting smoking himself.
Exactly. He talked about how he got hooked around the same age his son was now, how incredibly hard it had been for him to stop.
Did he connect it to the present?
Yeah, he even gently reminded his son about his own irritating cough, the father's cough, and how the son himself had previously said he wanted his dad to quit, bringing the son's own passwords into it.
Clever.
Yeah.
But he didn't demand the son stop? Or list the dangers?
No, the sources are quite clear. He didn't exhort him to stop or make threats or warn him about their dangers. None of that.
He just laid out his own difficult personal experience with that exact behavior.
And what being hooked had really meant for him, the cost to him personally.
And what happened? What was the outcome?
Well, apparently his son actually thought about it,
Right.
really processed what his dad had shared, that vulnerability.
Yeah.
And he decided on his own not to smoke until after high school. And the sources say she actually never started.
Wow. That's a success.
But there's more. What's maybe even more impactful.
Yeah.
That conversation where the father admitted his own struggle and regret, it also motivated Sirhusen himself to finally quit smoking. Yeah. He successfully quit with his family's support, apparently spurred on by that very conversation with his son.
That's incredible. So admitting his own mistake and its consequences didn't just influence his son.
It bounced back and triggered his own positive change.
It really shows how sharing your past struggles, especially maybe when you're part of the negative example yourself,
Can be such a powerful, non-judgmental way to influence someone else's choices.
and it can create this space where, like you said, both people can potentially grow. It's not just one-way correction.
Exactly. It becomes a shared reflection almost.
So looking across all these examples, they're so different, aren't they? The new secretary, the typist with spelling issues, that intense situation with the Kaiser, the parent talking to their teen.
Yeah, the range is pretty wide.
But what really stands out from your source material is how consistently effective this core principle seems to be.
It really does seem to work across the board. And it highlights that talking about your own mistakes first.
Yeah.
It isn't about being weak or overly self-deprecating.
No, it feels more like a strategic move almost.
A strategic act of humility, maybe? Something that just melts away the other person's defensiveness, almost instantly sometimes, based on these stories.
Yeah, it builds that bridge of trust, that sense of, okay, we're both human here.
Which creates the space needed for them to actually hear the message, right? Without feeling attacked or lectured from someone pretending to be perfect.
It lets them save face and see you not as this critical judge.
But as someone who gets it, someone who understands the difficulty, or just the human tendency to mess up sometimes.
We're basically saying, I'm in the same boat, let's figure this out together.
Yeah, rather than I'm safely on the shore shouting instructions at you while you're sinking. Totally different vibe.
Okay, so based on this whole deep dive into the source material you shared, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah.
Is there a difficult conversation you've been putting off? Maybe one where you need to point out a mistake or suggest an improvement.
We all have those sometimes.
How might starting that conversation, not with the problem itself, but by first genuinely, vulnerably sharing a relevant mistake or struggle you've personally experienced, how might that fundamentally change the way it's heard?
Yeah.
And maybe even the entire outcome?
Something to think about, definitely.